The sun had barely risen over the Arizona desert when Officer Mark Reynolds pulled his cruiser beneath the I-10 overpass on the outskirts of Phoenix. The air was already heavy with heat, and the wind carried the faint smell of dust and gasoline. A call had come in before dawn, a body found by a truck driver. It wasn't unusual in this part of town, but something about the dispatcher's quiet tone made Mark uneasy. The man lay curled near a concrete pillar, his belongings scattered: a torn backpack, an empty bottle of water, a worn Bible with no name inside. His clothes were faded, but his shoes were oddly new, spotless, almost out of place. Mark crouched beside the body, his hand instinctively hovering near the man's wrist, cold, lifeless, yet his face carried no sign of pain, only the stillness of someone who had long stopped fighting. "Probably another overdose," one of the younger officers muttered, shaking his head. "These guys, they just give up." Mark didn't answer. He'd seen hundreds of scenes like this over 20 years on the force, but this one pulled at something deeper, something he couldn't name. The man's hands caught his attention, calloused, thick-skinned, hands that once built things, not the hands of a drifter. He looked more like someone who'd been useful once before the world forgot his name. "Bag everything," Mark said quietly. "Let's do this right." As the evidence techs began their slow, methodical work, Mark stepped back, staring at the highway above. Cars rushed past, people heading to their jobs, their breakfasts, their lives, unaware of the man below them whose story had ended unnoticed. That morning would become just another report in a stack of forgotten tragedies. But for reasons he couldn't explain, Mark felt this one would stay with him. Before we continue, if you're drawn to stories like this, stories of truth buried beneath time, of people forgotten by the world but never by fate, make sure to subscribe. Every story here uncovers the silent corners of America, where justice still whispers, waiting to be heard. The coroner arrived within the hour. No ID, no wallet, no tattoos, just a weathered body and a pair of brand-new sneakers. "You'll never find out who he was," the coroner said softly. "Cases like this, they fade." Mark nodded, but his mind disagreed. Something about the man's quiet dignity refused to fade. When the report was filed, male, approximately 45, cause of death undetermined, it felt more like a dismissal than an answer. That night Mark returned home, poured himself a glass of whiskey and opened his case notebook. He wrote 3 words across the top of the page: "The man under I-10." Then he underlined them twice. Outside, the desert wind howled across the streets of Phoenix, carrying sand and silence through the alleys. And though the city slept, one question remained wide awake inside him. Who was he, and why did no one care? Detective Mark Reynolds sat at his desk, the hum of the old fluorescent lights above him, mixing with the quiet tap of a typewriter somewhere down the hall. The precinct in downtown Phoenix was a maze of beige walls and stale coffee, the kind of place where cases lived and died in folders. The report on his desk read, "Unidentified male found deceased, underpass I-10, possible overdose." It was dated May 3rd, 1999. He rubbed his temples, staring at the few items collected from the scene: the torn backpack, the Bible, the shoes. "You ever get that feeling something's not what it looks like?" he asked his partner, Detective Carla Ruiz, who was reviewing another file across the room. Carla shrugged. "Mark, it's the 3rd one this month. Same area, same story. Homeless, no witnesses, no family. You know how it goes." He nodded, but didn't agree. There was no needle nearby, no track marks, no sign of struggle, just a man who looked like he'd sat down to rest and never woke up. The coroner's report would come back in a week confirming possible heart failure, but even that sounded hollow to Mark. Over the next few days, he canvassed the area. He spoke to a few people living under the bridge, men whose eyes told stories too heavy to carry. One of them, an older veteran named Eli, remembered the dead man. "Quiet guy," Eli said, "kept to himself, didn't drink much. Worked odd jobs when he could." "Did he ever tell you his name?" Mark asked. Eli shook his head. "Nope, but he used to fix people's shoes. Said his hands were good for something still." The words lingered with Mark as he walked back to his car. Hands that build, hands that fix. He couldn't shake it. He checked missing person reports from 1998 and early 99, dozens of names, none matching. No fingerprints in the database, no dental matches. Whoever the man was, the world had erased him long before death had. By the end of the month, the file grew thinner, the updates shorter. No further leads, the captain wrote in the margin. The press never called. The city moved on. Mark didn't. Every few nights he'd open the file again, rereading the same lines as if a new clue might appear between them. But the more he searched, the more the silence grew. One evening, as he sat alone in the dim light of his office, Carla stopped by the doorway. "You've done what you could, Mark," she said softly. "Some stories don't get endings." He looked up, tired eyes meeting hers. "Every story has an ending," he replied. "We just don't always stick around long enough to find it." But within a week, the captain ordered the case closed. The folder was sealed, labeled Unsolved, John Doe, 1999, and placed on a shelf among hundreds of others gathering dust. Mark left the precinct that night with a heaviness he couldn't name, unaware that this case, the one that went nowhere, would one day come back to define everything he thought he knew about truth, justice, and memory. 25 years later, the Arizona sun still burned with the same relentless heat. In a quiet corner of the State Department of Public Safety, Sarah Lawson sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of aging case files. The air conditioner hummed softly, but the smell of dust and old paper still lingered. It was her first year as a cold case analyst, not the most glamorous job, but one she'd fought hard to get. Sarah wasn't like most in her department. Where others saw forgotten paperwork, she saw fragments of stories waiting to be pieced back together. Her colleagues teased her for caring too much, for believing that every nameless file represented a person who once mattered, but she didn't care. After losing her own brother in a hit-and-run years ago, a case that was never solved, she'd made a quiet promise to herself. No one deserved to be forgotten. That afternoon, while sorting through archived homicide folders, she pulled out a thin brown file with faded ink. Unsolved. John Doe, 1999. Inside were only 3 photos, a man lying beneath an overpass, a pair of worn shoes, and a report signed by a name she didn't recognize, Detective Mark Reynolds. Something about the image stopped her. The man's expression wasn't vacant. It was almost peaceful, as if he'd simply grown tired of waiting for life to get better. She skimmed through the old notes. No leads. No identification. No follow-up. The case had been closed within weeks. Sarah leaned back in her chair, running her thumb along the folder's edge. "Who were you?" she murmured to herself. Her co-worker, Ben Wallace, poked his head over the cubicle wall. "Talking to ghosts again, Lawson?" She smiled faintly. "Maybe. Some of them still deserve to be heard." Ben shook his head. "That one's ancient history. You'll never find anything on it." "Maybe," she said, but her eyes didn't leave the photo. Later that evening, long after most analysts had gone home, Sarah stayed behind. The fluorescent lights flickered above her as she logged into the department's new digital archive system, scanning the file into the database. Her supervisor, Captain Hughes, appeared in the doorway. "You're still here?" "Just finishing some digitization work," she replied carefully. He stepped closer, recognizing the file on her desk. "That case, forget it. It's a dead end. No prints, no DNA, no suspect. Don't waste time on ghosts, Lawson." She nodded, pretending to agree, but her mind was already elsewhere. The moment he left, she reopened the file, studying every detail again. The shoes. The Bible. The calloused hands. Something inside her stirred. That same pull she'd felt when she first joined this job. The kind of instinct that doesn't ask for permission. She whispered under her breath, almost as a vow, "I'll find out who you were." The clock read 9:47 p.m. The office was silent except for the hum of computers and the faint buzz of a dying light. Sarah closed the file gently, already knowing that tomorrow she would start digging, quietly, carefully, and alone. 2 weeks into her quiet investigation, Sarah Lawson realized she needed help. The 1999 file was too thin, too vague, filled with dead ends that only someone who had lived that era could navigate. There was one name that kept echoing at the bottom of every report: Detective Mark Reynolds. After searching through internal directories, she learned he had retired 15 years earlier and now lived in Flagstaff, a small mountain town far from the desert heat. Sarah hesitated before dialing the number she found in an old personnel database. When a deep, weathered voice answered, it carried both suspicion and fatigue. "Mark Reynolds," he said flatly. "Detective Reynolds, this is Sarah Lawson, Cold Case Division, Phoenix. I'm sorry to bother you, but I've been reviewing an old case you worked, the John Doe from under the I-10, 1999. There was a pause, a breath that carried memory. "That one," he said. "I remember. I think there might be something there, something that was missed," she continued carefully. "Would you be willing to talk?" Another silence. Then, "Most of those old ghosts should stay buried. But, if you're serious, come by tomorrow. I'll be at Jensen's Diner around 10. The next morning, the road to Flagstaff stretched endlessly beneath a pale sky. Sarah's car climbed from the desert into cooler air, pine trees replacing cactus. She rehearsed what to say, unsure if he'd even show. When she walked into the diner, she spotted him immediately. Grey hair, sun-marked skin, eyes that had seen too much. He sat by the window with a black coffee in hand. "You're early," he said as she approached. "So are you," she replied, offering a faint smile. He studied her for a moment. "You remind me of myself back then, thinking the system still listens if you shout loud enough." "I don't shout," she said. "I just don't like silence." He nodded slowly. "Fair enough." Sarah placed the folder between them. "I digitized your case notes. There's not much, no prints, no witnesses, but something doesn't add up." The shoes were new, expensive, and the man's hands showed signs of hard labor. He wasn't just another drifter. Mark stared at the photos for a long time, tracing the edge of one with his thumb. "He had a name," he said softly. "I just never found it." "Then let's find it now," Sarah said, her tone steady. He looked up at her, not with doubt, but with the quiet recognition of someone who had once carried the same fire. "You really think you can bring him back after 25 years? "I think I owe him the effort," she said. "Don't you?" Mark leaned back in his chair, the faintest smile ghosting across his face. "You're stubborn, I like that. All right, Lawson. Let's see if there's anything left in the ashes." Outside, the snow began to fall lightly over the northern Arizona streets, and as they walked toward her car, neither of them noticed that the wind had shifted, carrying the scent of something stirring after decades of silence. Back in Phoenix, Sarah and Mark sat side by side in the cold case office, the hum of the computers filling the silence between them. Old evidence boxes lay open across the table, paper bags marked 1999 in fading ink, a few labeled items, and one sealed envelope containing a hair sample. Mark watched as Sarah handled it carefully, her gloved hands steady. "Technology's different now," she said almost to herself. "We can run this through the new national database. Even a partial DNA could tell us something." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You really think after 25 years there's enough left to find anything?" Sarah smiled faintly. "I don't think, I hope." They sent the sample to the state forensic lab and waited. Days stretched into a week. Mark spent the time revisiting his old notes, muttering under his breath about things he wished he'd done differently. Sarah noticed how his hands shook slightly when he read the report's final line. "Case closed. Insufficient evidence." "You blamed yourself," she said quietly one evening. He looked up. "You don't forget the ones you fail." On the 8th day, Sarah received an alert in her inbox. "DNA match, Thomas Greer, male, born 1953, last known address, Glendale, Arizona. Missing since 1998. Her pulse quickened as she printed the report. "Mark," she called, voice trembling with disbelief. He had a name. He stared at the paper as though reading it twice to make sure it was real. "Thomas Greer," he repeated slowly. "God, I remember that name from Missing Persons." "Worked construction, didn't he?" "Yeah," Sarah replied, scanning the linked record. "Foreman at a company called Merritt and Sons. Vanished after missing a paycheck and never returned. No foul play suspected. Mark leaned back, exhaling through his nose. Nobody suspected anything because nobody looked. The next few days became a blur of phone calls and database requests. Sarah contacted former co-workers, tracked old job sites, and pieced together fragments of a life. Thomas had been a skilled builder, known for his precision and silence. After his wife and daughter died in a car accident, he'd withdrawn, working long hours and drifting between temporary housing. By late 1998, he'd stopped showing up altogether. One co-worker remembered him vividly. Tom was quiet, he told Sarah over the phone, but he wasn't broken. He said he was saving money to start over somewhere. Then one day, he just didn't come back. Doug, our site manager, said he quit. Doug? Sarah asked. Doug who? Merritt, the man replied. Doug Merritt, owner's son. Ran the crew back then. Sarah scribbled the name down, her mind already churning. Mark watched her from across the table, a look of cautious satisfaction on his face. Every name is a thread, he said. You just pulled the first one. As Sarah closed the file that night, her eyes lingered on Thomas Greer's photo, a man whose identity had vanished under concrete and silence. For the first time, she felt they were no longer chasing a ghost. They were chasing a man who had once lived, loved and lost, and someone who might have wanted him gone. The next step was the hardest one, reaching out to the people Thomas Greer had left behind. Sarah found a name in the old address record, Linda Greer, listed as his sister, last known residence in Tucson, Arizona. Mark offered to drive with her, and though she didn't say it, Sarah was grateful for the company. The desert highway stretched endlessly ahead of them, the afternoon sun bleaching the landscape into shades of gold and rust. Mark broke the silence first. You ever think about what it does to families, not knowing? Sarah glanced at him. Every day. My brother's case was never solved. My mum used to leave the porch light on for a year after he died. Hope can turn cruel when it stays too long. Mark nodded slowly. Yeah, that sounds about right. When they reached Tucson, Linda's small house sat at the edge of an aging neighborhood. Wind chimes clinked in the dry air as Sarah knocked. After a moment, a woman in her late 60s opened the door, her eyes cautious but kind. Mrs. Greer? Sarah asked gently. I'm Sarah Lawson, and this is Mark Reynolds. We're from the Department of Public Safety. May we come in for a moment? Linda hesitated, then stepped aside. If this is about Thomas, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I told the police everything I knew back then. They said he probably left town. Sarah's throat tightened. That's actually why we're here, Ma'am. We've identified remains found in 1999. We believe they belong to your brother. Linda froze. The ticking of a wall clock filled the silence. Her hand reached for the back of a chair, gripping it as tears welled in her eyes. You found him, she whispered. After all this time? Sarah nodded, lowering her voice. I'm so sorry. We're still trying to understand what happened to him. Linda sat down slowly, her expression distant. He wasn't a bad man, just broken. After his wife and little girl died, he stopped living. I tried to help, but he shut me out. The last time we spoke, he said someone from work had been calling him, someone he didn't trust. Did he say who? Mark asked. She shook her head. No. Just that it was about money or something he found on a job site. He said he was scared, but I didn't think much of it then. I thought he was just tired. Sarah exchanged a glance with Mark, a quiet, knowing look that said the same thing without words. This wasn't an accident. Linda wiped her tears, her voice soft but firm. Please. If you can tell me what happened to him, I'll finally be able to sleep. We'll do everything we can, Sarah said. As they left the house, the sky over Tucson burned with the colors of a dying sunset. Mark adjusted his sunglasses, exhaling slowly. Someone called him before he vanished. That's where we start. Sarah nodded, her jaw set with quiet determination. The case that had slept for 25 years was awake again, and the past was beginning to stir. The name Doug Merritt echoed in Sarah's mind as she and Mark drove back toward Phoenix. The air grew heavier the closer they got to the city, a tension neither of them spoke aloud. Merritt & Sons still existed, though now under a slightly different name, Merritt Construction Group. According to public records, Doug had taken over after his father's retirement and was now a respected business figure in Mesa. Sarah looked at the company's sleek website glowing on her laptop. "You'd never guess this man once ran the same crew Thomas worked for," she said quietly. "Everything about him looks clean." Mark smirked without humor. "In my experience, the clean ones are usually the dirtiest." The next morning, they walked through the polished glass doors of the Merritt office. The air smelled of new carpet and coffee. A young receptionist smiled politely as Sarah flashed her badge. "We'd like to speak with Mr. Merritt," she said. Doug Merritt arrived a few minutes later, mid-50s, confident, his smile measured. "Detective Reynolds, haven't seen you in years," he said, extending a hand. Mark didn't take it. "This is Investigator Lawson," Mark replied curtly. "We're looking into the disappearance of one of your former employees, Thomas Greer." Doug's expression didn't change, but his shoulders stiffened slightly. "Greer, that was ages ago. He quit suddenly, never came back." "We thought he'd left town." Sarah studied him. "Were you close?" Doug gave a small laugh. "Close? No. He was quiet, hard worker, kept to himself. Why all this interest now?" "We've identified his remains," Mark said evenly. "Found in 1999 under an overpass in Phoenix." The color drained slightly from Doug's face before he recovered. "That's unfortunate. But I can't help you. It's been 25 years. Sarah noticed the twitch in his jaw, brief but sharp. "Do you recall any disagreements with him before he disappeared?" "None," he said quickly. "Look, if you're suggesting I had anything to do with it, that's absurd." "No one's suggesting that," Sarah replied, her voice calm but firm. "We're just trying to understand what happened." Doug crossed his arms. "Then maybe look somewhere else. People like him, they wander off all the time." Mark's tone hardened. "People like him? You mean the ones who work for a living, then vanish when they see something they shouldn't?" Doug's composure cracked for a second, his eyes narrowing. "What's your tone, detective?" "I've got nothing to hide." Sarah glanced toward a photo frame on his desk, a construction crew smiling in front of a half-built complex. In the corner, a familiar face stood half-turned, Thomas Greer. On the back of the photo, written faintly in pen, was the date, December 12, 1998, just weeks before Thomas disappeared. "We'll be in touch," Sarah said, slipping a business card onto the desk. As they stepped outside, the sunlight hit them like a wall. Mark exhaled slowly. "He's lying." "Yeah," Sarah murmured, eyes fixed on the horizon. "And that photo? It's going to lead us somewhere he doesn't want us to go." The next morning, Sarah sat in her office staring at the photo from Doug Merritt's desk. The edges were frayed, but the image was sharp enough to tell a story. Thomas Greer standing stiffly among co-workers, his eyes distant, shoulders tense. She traced the date on the back with her thumb. December 12th, 1998. Weeks before his disappearance. Something in that picture felt wrong. Mark entered, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you've been up all night." "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "There's more to that man than he's letting on. He wasn't surprised to hear Thomas was dead. He was scared." Mark set the coffee down, watching her carefully. "Be careful, Lawson. Merritt's got money and friends in the right places. You poke too hard, you'll make enemies you don't even see coming." Before she could answer, Captain Hughes appeared at her doorway, his tone clipped. "Lawson, a word." In his office, the blinds were half closed, the morning sun cutting across the floor in sharp lines. Hughes folded his arms. "I got a call from the Merritt Group's legal department. They say you and Reynolds showed up unannounced yesterday, asking questions about something that's been closed for decades." Sarah kept her voice steady. "We're following a lead on an identified victim, sir. There's reason to believe," he interrupted, "that you're chasing ghosts and making this department look like it doesn't know when to quit. Drop it, Lawson." We don't have the budget or the jurisdiction for a PR mess. Her pulse quickened. With respect, sir, if we stop because someone powerful complains, we're not doing our jobs. Hughes sighed, leaning forward. You're good, Sarah. Don't throw your career away over a case that's older than you were when it started. That's an order. Back at her desk, Mark was waiting. One look at her face told him everything. They shut you down? Officially, she said. Unofficially, we keep going. He gave a weary chuckle. You're going to get us both fired. Maybe, she said. But if we stop now, someone like Merritt gets to bury the truth all over again. Mark nodded slowly. Then we do it off the record. Quietly. That evening, Sarah returned alone to the evidence archive. The air was thick with dust and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. She found the original storage box labeled Greer, 1999, and set it on the table. Inside were only a few items: the Bible, a receipt from a convenience store, and a key tag with the number 1482 engraved on it. She turned it over, her brow furrowing. Storage locker, she whispered. A surge of determination replaced the exhaustion in her chest. Someone had left this behind for a reason, something the original investigation never uncovered. She tucked the key into her pocket, her heart steady now. For the first time, the case felt alive again. She wasn't just reopening a file. She was walking straight into a story someone had tried very hard to erase. The next morning, Sarah sat at her desk, the storage key still clenched in her hand. She had run the number on it through every database she could think of, but there was nothing. No record of a locker associated with the key. It didn't make sense. The key had been left in Thomas's belongings, deliberately placed there, and yet there was no obvious connection to anything. She couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was right in front of her, like a puzzle piece she had yet to fit into place. Mark walked in, coffee in hand. You look like you've been thinking all night again. Sarah didn't look up. I think I found something, but it doesn't make sense. This key was in Thomas's stuff. It's for a storage locker, but the number doesn't match any of the places we know about. Mark set the coffee down next to her and slid into the chair. A storage locker? What are we looking for, Sarah? I'm not sure yet, but something told me I needed to check it out. I've called a few of the places near the area where he was found, but nothing. No one seems to remember him. She leaned back, frustrated. Mark sat quietly, letting her think. She stared at the key, her fingers gently rubbing the worn edges. It was old, maybe too old to still be relevant, but it was part of the case, and that meant it had to mean something. Her phone buzzed. A text message from Ben Wallace, the tech guy from the department. Check the old U-Haul rental places on the north side of town. There's something you might want to see. She stared at the message for a beat. The hairs on her neck stood up. U-Haul. That was the kind of place someone would use to move things, especially if they didn't want to be seen. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the pieces beginning to fall into place. Mark, she said, her voice low, I think I know where we need to go. They arrived at the U-Haul location near the outskirts of Phoenix an hour later. The lot was quiet, tucked away behind a chain-link fence that was covered in overgrown ivy. The storage facility seemed small, a few rows of old units behind the front office. The air was thick with the smell of dust and exhaust fumes. Inside the office, the clerk, a tired-looking man in his 50s, didn't seem surprised when Sarah showed him the key. He studied it for a moment, then sighed. Yeah, I remember this one. It was rented out in the late 90s, real short-term rental. Didn't think much of it at the time. But it's been empty for years. Do you have any records? Sarah asked, her heart racing. The clerk turned to a dusty filing cabinet and pulled out an old folder. Here it is. Rental was under the name Thomas Greer. He paid for a month in advance, but no one ever came back to pick up their things. Sarah's pulse quickened. This was it. She hadn't expected it to be this simple. The man had rented the locker, paid up front and left it behind. What had he been storing? The clerk led them to the unit at the far end of the lot. The lock had long since rusted, but the door creaked open with a sharp, guttural sound. Inside, the dim light revealed a collection of old furniture, boxes, and a few personal items. Nothing too unusual, except for one thing. A cardboard box was wedged in the corner, labeled for Linda. Sarah felt her breath catch. It was clear now. Thomas had been preparing something for his sister, something that had never been delivered. She slowly lifted the box, her heart racing. What could it contain? And more importantly, what had Thomas found that he was willing to risk everything to hide? The box was heavier than Sarah expected. She set it down on a dusty table in the dim light of the U-Haul storage unit, trying to steady her breath. Mark stood behind her, a hand resting on his hip, eyes fixed on the box as if it held the answers they'd been searching for. She carefully cut the tape, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside, she found stacks of old construction paperwork, contracts, blueprints, and even payroll records from Merritt and Sons. Thomas had kept these records hidden. His handwriting appeared sporadically, making quick notes in the margins, but one sheet stood out. A memorandum that looked like a draft of a report, but it was incomplete. The lines Thomas had written were unmistakable. They detailed a series of violations on the job sites, shoddy materials, ignored safety protocols, and most damning of all, falsified inspection reports. The kind of things that could get a company shut down, or worse, lead to fatalities. Sarah's heart raced. This was the bombshell they had been looking for. She glanced at Mark, who seemed to read her thoughts without saying a word. This wasn't just about Thomas anymore. This was about Doug Merritt and the company he'd inherited. Doug knew, Sarah whispered. He knew about these violations. Thomas was going to blow the whistle. Mark nodded grimly. And someone made sure he didn't get the chance. She took a photo of the document, then sifted through the rest of the papers. There were invoices, receipts, and a notebook with detailed job site reports, but it was the final page that caught her eye. A small, scribbled note. Doug's behind it all. The accident was covered up. We'll both pay if I go public. I'm out. I'll never return. Sarah's stomach twisted. Thomas had been desperate. He had figured it out. And in the end, it had cost him his life. They spent another hour in the storage unit, combing through the papers, but they found nothing more of importance. As Sarah sealed the box back up, she felt a sense of both dread and relief. They now had the proof they needed. But the real work had just begun. Back at her office, Sarah and Mark sat down to discuss their next move. "We need to get these records to the authorities," Sarah said, her voice steady. "This isn't just a cold case anymore. We're talking about corporate fraud, safety violations. People could have died because of this." Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face. "You're right, but we also have to think about how we approach this. Doug Merritt has a lot of power, and he won't go down without a fight." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "I know, but we can't let him bury this. Not again." They both fell into silence, the weight of the case pressing heavily on them. They had the evidence. They had the truth. But there were still too many unknowns. Too many people who might be willing to protect Merritt, no matter the cost. "It's going to get messy," Mark said, breaking the silence. "Are you ready for that?" "I'm not backing down," Sarah replied, her voice firm. "We finish this." And with that, they both knew. The real fight was just beginning. It was late in the afternoon when Sarah and Mark arrived at the small, unassuming office of Merritt Construction Group. The air inside felt too still, almost oppressive, as if the building was holding its breath. The receptionist greeted them, though she seemed uneasy as she led them through the hallway, lined with framed awards and glossy photos of projects. They reached the office of Doug Merritt, who sat behind his polished desk, his posture perfect, his face carefully composed. Doug's smile was tight as he stood to greet them. "Detective Reynolds, Investigator Lawson, what brings you here today?" His voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it, an undercurrent of tension that Sarah didn't miss. "We need to talk, Doug," Mark said, his tone flat, "about the safety violations at Merritt and Sons. And about a man named Thomas Greer." Doug's eyes narrowed, but he kept his smile in place. "That's quite the accusation. What's this all about?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady. "We found something, Doug, something that ties you to a cover-up. Thomas Greer was about to go public with your company's safety violations. You made sure he didn't get the chance." Doug stiffened, his hands clenching around the edges of his desk. I have no idea what you're talking about, he said, his voice suddenly hard. Mark exchanged a look with Sarah before continuing. We know about the faked inspection reports, the substandard materials. We also know that Thomas was ready to blow the whistle. He said so in his notes, right before he disappeared. Doug's face flushed, and for a split second, Sarah saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. He quickly recovered, leaning back in his chair, the mask of composure slipping back into place. You've got nothing. Those are just rumors. The past is the past. I don't see why this is relevant anymore. But Sarah could feel it. The pressure was building. Doug was lying, and he knew it. She stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. It's relevant because people's lives were at risk, Doug. People like Thomas. He had evidence that you didn't want anyone to see. You knew what he found, and you knew he was going to expose it. Doug's gaze darted briefly toward the door as though contemplating an escape. But then, slowly, his shoulders slumped, and he let out a long breath, the facade cracking. You don't understand, he said quietly. He was going to ruin everything. The company, my father's legacy. I couldn't let him do that. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to admit it, at least not so soon. So what? You killed him? Doug's eyes flicked toward the floor, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I didn't mean for it to happen. We had an argument. He threatened to go to the authorities. I lost control. I was trying to make him see reason, but then things went too far. Mark leaned forward, his voice cold. You pushed him, didn't you? Pushed him until he had no choice but to run. You made sure he never came back. Doug's face twisted with guilt, his hands shaking. I didn't want him dead. I just wanted him to stop, to leave the company alone. I didn't think it would go this far. The confession hung in the air like a heavy weight, and for a moment no one spoke. Doug Merritt's mask had finally fallen, and the truth was as ugly as Sarah had feared. I'll make a statement, Doug said finally, his voice barely audible. But you have to understand, I didn't plan it. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Mark nodded, his expression unreadable. We'll make sure the rest of the world understands, Doug. You're not getting away with this. As they left the office, the weight of Doug's confession settled on Sarah's shoulders. It wasn't over yet, but they had the truth now. And truth, no matter how painful, was the first step toward justice. The hours following Doug Merritt's confession were tense. Sarah and Mark sat in the small, cluttered office, the weight of everything hanging in the air between them. The truth had been exposed, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. We have his confession, but we still need the hard evidence, Mark said, tapping his fingers against the edge of the desk. Something that ties Merritt to the crime. He's got enough connections to weasel out of this if we don't have the proof. Sarah nodded. She hadn't expected it to be easy, but the urgency was palpable now. The department had to move fast. She rifled through the files on her desk, scanning the records one more time. Then it hit her. The payroll records from the storage box, the ones that had been hidden away by Thomas. They detailed payments made to workers, including Doug Merritt's name. What if there were discrepancies in the records? What if someone had altered them to cover up their tracks? She reached for the phone. I need the original payroll records for Merritt and Sons from 1998. I'm going to compare them with what we found. It took a few hours for the information to come through, but once it did, Sarah's eyes scanned the documents quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. The numbers didn't lie. Doug Merritt had falsified reports to cover up the hours worked by Thomas, and the payments made to him had been manipulated, hidden among other payments that seemed unusually large for the work done. She held up the papers for Mark to see. This is it. This is where he cleaned up the mess. He knew what Thomas had found, and he made sure to hide it. If we take this to the DA, we've got him. Mark studied the documents carefully. This is good, real good, but if we present this now, Merritt's going to fight it tooth and nail. He's already started covering his tracks. They both knew the reality. Merritt would try to deny, discredit, and confuse the case, but the evidence was undeniable. Doug Merritt had committed fraud, and worse, he'd been complicit in the death of Thomas Greer. Let's do it, Sarah said. Her voice was quiet but firm, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. We've got the confession, the records, and now the proof. Mark nodded, his expression hardening. Time to make sure he pays for what he did. The next day they presented their findings to the district attorney. Sarah laid out every piece of evidence, from the payroll discrepancies to Doug Merritt's confession. It wasn't an easy sell, but it was enough. The DA agreed to press charges. Doug Merritt was arrested the following morning. The media storm that followed was swift and unforgiving. Merritt's reputation, years in the making, crumbled before the eyes of the public. Sarah watched the news coverage with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The case was far from over. A trial would follow, and there were still many legal battles to fight. But for now, for today, the truth had won. As she sat in her office watching the sun set over the city, Sarah allowed herself a brief moment of quiet. The road had been long, the fight difficult, but Thomas Greer's story had been heard, and that was all that mattered. The news of Doug Merritt's arrest spread like wildfire through Phoenix. By the next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Construction tycoon arrested for role in 1999, death of former worker, and Merritt & Sons scandal, fraud, cover-up, and a murdered whistleblower. Sarah sat in her office, staring at the screen as the story broke across every channel. It felt surreal, watching the city react to something that had been buried for so long. The weight of the case hung heavily in her chest, but there was no time for celebration. The trial would come soon, and they were far from done. "What's it feel like to bring a man like that down?" Mark's voice broke through her thoughts. She looked up at him, eyes tired but resolute. "I don't know yet, feels like we're just getting started." Mark leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "I hear you, but for what it's worth, this is a victory. You gave Thomas a voice again, that counts for something." Sarah didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned back to the TV, where reporters were detailing Merritt's arrest in front of his office, the cameras capturing his handcuffed figure being escorted into a police car. The image seemed almost surreal. Doug Merritt, a man who had once seemed untouchable, now reduced to just another criminal facing justice. But the arrest wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something larger. People began to speak up. Former employees came forward with their stories about the conditions at Merritt & Sons, stories about safety violations, bribed inspectors, and injuries that were swept under the rug. Those who had stayed silent for years now felt emboldened. The community was in shock, but they were also starting to demand accountability. The media focused their cameras on the families who had been affected. Thomas's sister, Linda, appeared on local news. Her eyes were tired, but there was a quiet sense of relief in her voice. "It's been 25 years. I never thought I'd see the day." Sarah watched the interview, the weight of Linda's words sinking deep into her chest. This wasn't just about a murder case. It was about everything that had been ignored, every injustice that had been allowed to fester. Thomas's death had been a catalyst, but the ripple effect was much bigger. In the following days, more families came forward, each with their own stories of loss and betrayal. It seemed that Merritt & Sons had been a breeding ground for negligence, and now the company was under intense scrutiny. The community that had once turned a blind eye was now confronting its darkest secrets. But as the scandal grew, so did the pushback. Merritt's lawyers filed motion after motion, attempting to have the case dismissed. They argued that the evidence wasn't enough, that the confession was coerced, and that the charges were politically motivated. The legal battle was going to be a long, hard fight. As the trial date approached, Sarah met with Linda again. This time it was in the quiet of a small cafe, away from the media frenzy. Linda looked older now, wearier, but there was a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I never thought this day would come," Linda said, sipping her coffee slowly. "But you did it. You gave me my brother back. Even if the world didn't know his name, you made sure they would." Sarah smiled softly. "I didn't do it alone. It was all of us, the people who refused to forget." For a moment, the two of them sat in silence, watching the world outside the cafe window move on as if nothing had changed. But inside, something had. Something permanent. Sarah knew the fight wasn't over, but for now she allowed herself a quiet moment of peace. They had uncovered the truth, and that would never be taken away. As the weeks wore on, the pressure began to take its toll. The trial of Doug Merritt was set to begin, but it wasn't the legal battles or the courtroom drama that weighed on Sarah the most. It was the quiet, insidious costs, the whispers in the department, the subtle tensions that had crept into her relationships with colleagues, the endless phone calls and emails that she had to sift through just to keep moving forward. The weight of being the one who brought down someone like Doug Merritt was more than she had expected. When you expose something this big, the consequences ripple out far beyond what you can control. The department's resources had been stretched thin. People were questioning her methods, questioning the hours she'd put in, the time she'd sacrificed. Captain Hughes was still bitter. He didn't say it outright, but his silence spoke volumes. He had warned Sarah to let it go, to move on, to avoid the mess that Merritt would create. But Sarah had refused, and now, as the walls closed in, she wondered if she had made a mistake. She had known from the very start that seeking justice for Thomas Greer meant more than just uncovering the truth. It meant dealing with the fallout, and Sarah was beginning to feel it in every part of her life. Mark had been supportive, as always, but even he seemed weary, and their conversations often ended with long silences, both of them understanding that there was nothing more to say. They had done their part. Now, the rest was up to the courts, and Sarah feared the truth might be drowned in the noise of politics, influence, and power. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, Sarah opened the final piece of evidence that had been gathered, a letter Thomas had written to his sister Linda, the one that had been found in the storage unit. "If anything happens to me, it's Doug. He's covering something up and I can't live with it anymore. If I don't make it out, make sure the truth comes to light." The words felt like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. Thomas had known, even before he died, that he was running out of time. His warning, his desire to protect his sister and the truth, had driven him to hide what he had found. And now, all these years later, Sarah was the one who had picked up that broken thread. Tears blurred her vision as she read the letter over and over. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about a man who had been silenced, and the cost of uncovering the secrets he'd died to protect. The cost was no longer just hers to bear. The phone rang, interrupting the stillness. It was Linda Greer. "Sarah," Linda's voice trembled on the other end of the line. "I heard about the delays in the trial. I know it's hard, but we have to keep going, right? We can't let them win." Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. "We're not stopping, Linda. We'll see this through, I promise." But as she ended the call, she wasn't sure if the promise was for Linda or for herself. The truth had cost more than she had anticipated. And yet, in the end, Sarah knew there was no other choice. She had crossed the line and there was no going back. The truth, once exposed, would either redeem them or destroy them. But it was too late to turn back now. The trial had finally begun. It was as chaotic and relentless as Sarah had imagined, with the courtroom filled with tension. Doug Merritt sat at the defendant's table, his once immaculate appearance now slightly worn, his composure slipping. The media swarmed, capturing every moment, every glance, as the defense team worked tirelessly to discredit the evidence, to cast doubt on the confession, and to frame the case as nothing more than a misunderstanding, an unfortunate incident blown out of proportion. But Sarah wasn't focused on the noise outside the walls of the courtroom. She was here for Thomas, the man who had been lost to the world for too long, the one who had risked everything to bring the truth to light, even if it meant sacrificing his own life. And now his story was being told. As the prosecutor laid out the case, presenting the payroll records, the witness testimonies, and the confession from Doug, Sarah sat back, listening intently. The pieces had finally fallen into place, but even with the evidence stacked against Merritt, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. In the end, the case had always been more than just about Merritt's guilt. It was about what it represented, the dark underbelly of a system where powerful people could hide their wrongdoings for years, using their influence and money to bury the truth. It was about the people like Thomas Greer, who went unnoticed, their lives discarded as nothing more than collateral damage in a system built on greed. Sarah glanced over at Linda, who sat quietly in the front row, her eyes never leaving the stand. Linda had become Sarah's anchor throughout this entire process, offering words of encouragement when the weight of the case felt too heavy, reminding her that this fight was for more than just justice. It was for a man who had been forgotten by everyone but his sister. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity, but in the end, they returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. Doug Merritt was sentenced to life in prison, his empire reduced to rubble. When the news broke, it felt like the weight of the world had been lifted. Doug Merritt, the man who had built his fortune on lies and deceit, was finally being held accountable. The public outcry was immense, and for once the victims, the workers, the families Thomas Spruit were not forgotten. But for Sarah, the victory was bittersweet. She had won justice for Thomas, but the cost had been high. The weeks of sleepless nights, the strained relationships, the endless pressure, it had all taken its toll. There would be no grand celebration, no easy closure. The scars would remain, but so would the knowledge that she had done what was right, no matter the price. As Sarah left the courthouse that afternoon, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from a job well done, but the kind that came from knowing that the truth, however painful, had finally been set free. She stood outside watching the sun dip low over the horizon. The day was coming to a close, and with it a chapter of her life. But somewhere, in the back of her mind, she knew that she would never forget this case. The fight for truth, for justice, would always be a part of her. And no matter how many cases came after it, she would always carry the memory of Thomas Greer with her. His story, his fight had not been in vain. The truth, though delayed, had come to light, and in the end, that was all that mattered.